Hello and welcome to episode 149 of the Chills of Wood podcast. It's a pleasure today to be joined by Erika T. Wurth. And a little bit about Erika. Erika T. Wurth's literary horror novel, White Horse, is with Flatiron Macmillan. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in numerous journals, including Buzzfeed, Boulevard, Lithub, the Writer's Chronicle, and the Kenyon Review. She is a Kenyon and Sewanee fellow and a narrative artist for the Meow Wolf Denver installation. She is represented by Rebecca Friedman Books and Dana Spector CAA for film. She is an urban native of Apache, Chickasaw, Cherokee descent, and was raised outside of Denver, where she lives with her partner, her two stepchildren, and her extremely fluffy dogs. So fluffy, huh?
They're so fluffy.
I'm having some tongue twisters for some reason on some easy words, but other than that, I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm super honored to be on this. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's an honor. I've had your name on the radar for a long time.
Hmm.
Some other greats, you are the great writer's great writer. You're your favorite writer's favorite writer. I've got, Brandon Hobson spoke so highly of you, and Morgan Talty, and I'm sure I'm forgetting others, Ruben Degollado as well. And just in reading your book, you live up to the hype. You outdistance the hype.
Thank you. Those are great guys. They're all just so supportive. Just beyond belief. Brandon was somebody who, I saw his book come up around the same time There did. And it wasn't getting the attention that I thought it needed. So I tried to really, push it forward. And it was such a lovely book. And I was so excited when he was longlisted and then shortlisted for the NBA. That just made my heart glad.
I read his two books back to back, and it was like, whoa, this is a major talent.
Yes.
This is a
Yes.
major talent. I have doing a bonus episode for Patreon, and I was gonna do Louise Erdrich, not interview her. I wish I could have, right? Do a discussion of Louise Erdrich, and it was Marquez. They had the theme in some of the stories, and Tommy Orange. I was just gonna do the prologue, and I was like, you know what, this needs its own 30 minutes, just the prologue alone.
Oh yeah.
You're talking about there, so
there's a ton of information in there.
I was like, I can't do this. This needs to be
Mhm.
more time. So Dave Mustaine, Megadeth. Okay, I want to know any indications that he has read the book, because he is mentioned all throughout the book.
Where I grew up, it was a heavy metal town. I grew up in between two small towns outside of Denver, and my parents were like semi-middle class. They'd grown up very poor, but long story short, my dad liked to blow our money, and so we actually didn't grow up with a lot of, some middle class things that some of my peers in Idaho Springs didn't have. But I was bused to school in Idaho Springs, very working class. And I was kind of a hip hop and indie kid, but Megadeth, Metallica, all heavy metal was the soundtrack to my childhood.
Really?
And, over time, I've kind of circled back and realized how brilliant they were and why people love them so much. And I actually my people had pitched at Flatiron something about heavy metal and Megadeth to the NYT, and they seemed interested and then kind of dropped off. So I'm like, come on, dude. But yes, I keep getting in trouble on Twitter about Dave Mustaine. And I'm like, look, my character even says in the novel, I love him, but I try to stay away from his politics. He's what he is, right? Not single thing in my book is like a ringing endorsement. Although I have to admit, I do love Dave Mustaine and I do love Megadeth. So I don't know.
So we were up early today. My daughter had a soccer game. We were up so about 6:30, and I was like, you know what? She mentioned in the book, it's Hangar 18. The song is mentioned.
Yes.
So I'm just blasting Hangar 18 at 6:30 in the morning when everyone's rubbing the sleep out of their eyes. I'm like, that is a really good song.
Dude, I have to say, I understand now why people loved it so much growing up. The dude is so innovative. And I went to go see him play the other day with younger heavy metal bands, and they were astonishing. But it was like night and day. The guy can play, it's madness. And he's actually written articles in music magazines on his methodology. The guy is that talented. Yeah. And I love Hangar 18. It's brilliant. So
yeah, I was like, great call on that. So I appreciate that recommendation. You might have sent me down the rabbit hole a little bit,
Yeah.
So I saw that one of my favorite bands is Incubus.
Yeah.
And I saw that I need to catch up on my res, on the series. But I guess Brandon Boyd played the White Jesus.
Oh wow. Interesting.
So you mentioned things about like Mustaine is almost like a godlike figure, right?
Yeah. Well, I think in some ways, Carrie, she's very Gen Xy. She's a tough native chick from a small town.
Huh.
And so she's very tongue in cheek, and she'll say things, in a kind of a funny way, like I'm praying to Mustaine, but it's
Yeah.
kind of a joke. But at the same time, she kind of has a boner for him. Don't get me wrong, but
Right.
she doesn't want to marry him. But she kind of wants to be him in the sense of like, he
Yeah.
got out of where he came from. He's talented. He's unique. He doesn't care what people think. And I think she really relates to that. So,
Hmm. Yeah, I was referring to the Red Dogs, the Harjo, the classic, and yeah, I guess Brandon Boyd got his time playing Jesus, so that's funny.
yeah, I love Reservation Dogs. Yeah.
So maybe for Dave Mustaine's next book club, it'll be White Horse or first book club. I don't know.
I did get it to. I did try to get it to him. When I went to see Megadeth, I found this cool security guard. She was like a roundish my coloring. I don't know what her ethnic background was, but I suspected something like mine. And she seemed super cool. And I pleaded my case, and she said she would try. So we'll see. He did kind of appear in my feed, oddly, because of course I follow him, and I thought, so who knows? He might hate it though. He might be like, this is a stupid novel. It's terrible. So who knows?
So I got to admit, it took me a little while to figure out. I was like, okay, Idaho Springs. I assume that's in Idaho. I'm like, oh, that's a long drive for carrying the book. Like, all right, but I guess they're kind of close. My geography's not great. So you talk about Idaho Springs and other small towns around Denver. So tell us a little bit more about growing up there. So interesting that it had like a heavy metal aesthetic or sensibility, but your like literary language life. Like, I mean, did you speak? Is English your first? Are you monolingual? Do you dabble in Apache, other languages? And just kind of like what were you reading growing up? Like how I guess how constant was like the written word?
Idaho Springs is about 45 minutes outside of Denver, and Evergreen is about 30, 25. And Evergreen became more yuppie-ish faster than Idaho Springs because it was closer. And but like I said, I was bused to Idaho Springs, and there were a lot of working class folks, so lots of different demographics, primarily working class white, some middle class folks. I would qualify as middle class in some ways. And then, a handful of natives, Dene, Lakota, once in a while Anishinaabe, lots of Mexican Indians, which is, what I am as well, as alongside Chickasaw Cherokee descent. But the commonality was definitely like kind of poverty, anger. A lot of people, their families had worked in the mines. That's why they had come there originally. It was a tough little town, but I kind of admired the women there. They were like Carrie. She's kind of modeled after a woman that always like really heckled me, but I think that they heckled me because they were trying to toughen me up, and I was such a wiener. I did read all the time. I didn't grow up with I grew up with other Mexican Indians. They were indigenous, but they didn't always know what their tribal backgrounds were. And so I'm sure there were other Apaches. I didn't hear Apache growing up. I didn't hear Urtende. I didn't hear Chickasaw. What I heard primarily was Dene or Navajo and Lakota. And so sometimes I would hear those languages, and I don't even think I realized they weren't just words that everybody knew. And then Spanish was, of course, spoken. So it was kind of woven in here and there. You'd hear Navajo, or you'd hear Lakota, or you'd hear Spanish, and just here and there sprinkled. And so it was kind of peppered in there. And then later I kind of had to really think about like, oh, this is where I come from. It's very interesting because it's not, a lot of people try to make a binary, like you're the res or you're very upper middle class academic urban Indian. And I'm like, that's not my experience. And especially if you're talking about Denver or Chicago or Minneapolis, you're talking about like, generations of urban Indians sometimes that formed sort of like mine did. Like some of my family is from northern Mexico, and Porfirio Diaz kind of kicks them out at some point. And then I'm of Black descent, and I'm Chickasaw and Cherokee. You don't want to be Black at that time, even when the time in the Southeast when even some natives, were slave owning. So they met in Texas, and, they were ranchers. They were cowboys. They worked in factories, and like Chicago, like LA, like Minneapolis, they formed their own kind of unique urban Indian cultures. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. What I was reading growing up was just nerd lit. Someone tried to give me a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird once, and I was like, where are the dragons? Um, so I just liked all the nerdy stuff, all fantasy, all sci-fi, all horror. And when I went to do my undergraduate and then PhD in creative writing and lit, that was sort of ironed out of me. And I liked what I like to call realism. And then I realized I missed the dragons and more specifically the ghosts. And I wanted to see if I could marry these conventions that I admire in literary fiction, like complex characterization, depth of theme, and attention to form and language, and really pay attention to structure, and then add the things that I really loved. And so that's how this novel came about in relationship to where I am coming from.
Very interesting. So is it pronounced Chiricahua?
Chiricahua. I bet, what?
Chiricahua.
I wonder, you're right. Like maybe
Like what
Spanish speakers do say Chiricahua. Yeah, maybe.
Chiricahua. So would that be like Sonora? Like what's like northern Mexico, like very northern Mexico?
Right, exactly.
What is now?
Apparently, yeah, like my Chickasaw relative used to go, she had lots of husbands. One of them was my ancestor, who was Apache. And she liked them because they were more traditional, and she liked that. And so she would go down into northern Mexico, where apparently they were living in these box cars, and she would do ceremony, and she'd had nose cancer, which went into remission. And supposedly um, she helped out in the Mexican Revolution. And so
Whoa.
I've always wondered, since my family says, maybe we're related to Zapata, although they might have been like, they might have been like Indian related, like he was around, he was part of our group or family. I don't know. And so I was wondering what tribe he is, but I can't find anything. So yeah, that's a lot of where I'm coming from on that side.
Oh wow. Okay. So Spanish, I mean you talk about, so Spanish wasn't necessarily part of your family background, maybe it's more just people around in the town.
I don't, yeah, I don't actually, I remember a lot of different, Chicanos or Mexican Americans. And most of them looked pretty indigenous. Maybe one of them looked more Spanish, but of course that varies from family member to family member. So, and I remember bits and pieces. They didn't ever speak fluent Spanish, but there were bits and pieces of Spanish that they spoke and everyone spoke. So
Right. Very interesting. Well, you sent me down the rabbit hole again for like Idaho Springs and like the suburbs of Denver and that kind of thing. Very interesting. As you got into high school, into college, what were you reading? Well, you talked about a little bit. You wanted to get back to those dragons, like, so I guess maybe even more currently. And I got to guess, am I correct? I mean, it seems like I would guess you're a pretty artsy person. Like, you're not just nose in the book. You got your music. Like I guess more so like who are some of the authors or filmmakers or musicians even who continue to thrill you, inspire you,
well,
put you on the trajectory you're on?
yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, I listened to Dr. Dre
Hey.
um, and Snoop Dogg, and I listened to Pearl Jam, I listened to Nirvana, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and so I still listen to um, those guys, and I still listen to a lot of different alternative rock. And there's an indigenous um, heavy metal band that's in Denver called A Feather and Bone, and it's sad because I wanted to go take my niece to see them, and who's actually here right now with me. Um, but it's like the first day of my tour, so I can't do it. But yeah, I love Jhumpa Lahiri, I love Sandra Cisneros. I was really big into them. There's a writer I adore named Holly Goddard Jones. She wrote realism, she wrote crime, and then she wrote probably one of the best science fiction novels that is so tremendously underrated that I've ever read. The Salt Line. It's sort of a dystopia, and it's fantastic. um, and so, yeah, I have to say though, I don't have many hobbies beyond reading and writing. It's kind of sad. It's like you have to like make your life about it to make it happen. So,
That's not sad. That's not sad. So are you the person like Carrie who's got the book at the bar then?
oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely, yeah.
Nice. I don't know that I've ever pulled that. I've read almost everywhere else. That's I got to get on that. I've been
As a
inspired.
woman, it's a little hard though, because men assume you want company, and I'm like, I do not. So,
Okay, yeah. So being that you grew up in such a multicultural area, at least in your neighborhood for the most part, did you feel represented in what you read though? Being to come from so many different groups, were you looking for representation? Was that something that when you finally, when you did find it, you're like, oh, that's what I've been missing? Was it something you could have articulated? Just kind of, I guess, ideas around representation.
Yeah, and to be clear, some of my peers in Idaho Springs would not think of it as diverse. They would think of it as really white. And I think it's
Huh.
because that is how they were taught to think. They were taught to kind of like not think of us. You know what I mean? And
Mm.
when I have reconnected with them, I'm like, well, what about so and so? What about, what about, and they're like, oh yeah, oh yeah,
Mm.
oh. And so it's interesting to see how people like within their own families sometimes will have different narratives. But I didn't see representation. I went to Fort Lewis College, and the first time I read anything by a Native author was Ceremony, which is by Leslie Marmon Silver, which is a brilliant book,
Okay.
but very modernist. Um,
That was the
and
first time. The first time.
yeah, yes, yeah, no one is signed. I don't think I read one Black, Latinx, Asian author in high school. I don't think I read one, and certainly
Wow.
not an
The
Indigenous one.
canon, right?
Oh yeah, well, I
Oh
mean,
boy. A
a
quote
lot of
unquote.
people that I graduated with were illiterate. I mean, it was just not a
Oh
town
man.
where, but yeah, and someone tried to give me a copy of the Something of Little Tree, which is actually
Mm.
written by a former KKK Grand Dragon.
Are you serious?
Yeah, and I remember thinking like, because I don't wade into who's really Indian or not. I'm not interested in that
Mm.
conversation because I think it's
Mm.
gross. But that man is a former KKK dragon guy, and so
Mm.
I don't know. I don't think of, and it had a really suspiciously kind of goofy narrative, and I certainly didn't identify with that. And
Mm.
then, as I got older, I started reading more contemporary Native American lit, but it was very res.
Mhm.
And I was thinking, like, where are the urban Indians in all of this? And so,
Mm.
yeah, I think I was always, for years, I've been trying to talk about urban Indian culture, which is its own extremely diverse thing. There are people
Mm.
who are, I'm of some Black descent, but there are some people who are like Black Native communities in Canada, who are very
Right.
unrecognized. There's the Métis in Canada, and they're in their own like big fight about identity. Mexico is like, ranges from people of indigenous heritage who really don't know a lot about it, to people who are from very traditional communities. And so like it's really complicated. And I feel like I didn't see a lot of that. So
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you watch a lot of like Mexican soap operas, they all look like me. They're way
yeah,
more handsome, but like they're all European descent, right? And
yeah.
yeah. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Who in 2022? Who are you reading? Who are you teaching? Who are you recommending to friends?
In Native American realism, certainly there's Brandon Hobson, Kelly Jo Ford, Morgan Talty. They're great guys, and great folks in general. And then in Native American crime, there's my partner, David Haskell Wamley Wyden. He wrote Winter
Mm.
Counts. Of course, I'm biased, but I think it's
Mhm.
wonderful. And then for the horror writers, I have to admit, like, I do love Sylvia Moreno Garcia. I think she's a
Mhm.
genius. I love how subversive her book is. I love that the bad guy is a mushroom. It's just so weird. And I love that the main character is this noirish, kind of saucy, mean, smart, Native American person of Native American descent who is sent to this sort of misty part of Mexico,
Mm.
to figure out what's happened to her cousin because she's married this guy who's of British descent, right? And it's just this
Mm.
unfolding crazy thing. I love Grady Hendrix. He could write a book every 3 months, and I'd probably read it until I'm dead, and he's dead. Someone would have to be, dead. I love Stephen Graham Jones. He's my
Yeah.
Indigenous brother from another mother. This guy, so prolific, and he's so wonderfully weird. I love Ring Shot by P. DeJelly Clark. It talks about civil era racism in a way that's like stunning and brilliant. He's also a professor,
Mm.
just a phenomenal person. And of course, Rebecca Roanhorse, who's probably changed I think, the landscape of
Mm.
Indigenous fiction forever. She
Mm.
is reading Black Sun is like a magical ticket back to pre-Columbian times. And just, it's plot wise, it's fabulous, but just walking around a restaurant in Mayan territory and wishing I could do that. Just simply walk into a restaurant where, nothing is about anything beyond a normal day and, Indian life. Like it just sounds,
Mm,
it's magical in that way. So
wow. Now I'm sorry, the last one you're talking about, that's nonfiction?
no, Rebecca Roanhorse. No,
You-
it's
the
fiction.
Black Sun?
Hmm.
Okay, okay. Yeah, yeah. No, I've heard great things for sure.
Yeah, she's great.
So what was like what made you think you could be a writer? Was there a eureka moment or moments where like, have you been writing since you were 2 years old or well, 5 years old? Did someone you really respected say, "Wow, that's incredible. You need to be published." How did you really decide like, "Hey, this could be a vocation?"
I really don't know because I didn't have that experience. No one I knew was a writer. I just read extremely voraciously because I was kind of a weird kid and I loved that escapism and I loved reading it. And for some reason, at one point, very early on, 6 or 7, I said to myself that I wanted to be a writer. And I still have
Hmm.
no idea what prompted that. And, I had no idea what that meant either. And so my parents were just in a panic and they were like, how about, you write on the side and major in maybe biology. And I'm like, can't do math. So I did
Hmm.
English, and then I slowly worked my way into workshops as I got older and older. And I, started writing poems, stories, and then I started trying to put together novels, right? So yeah.
Wow. So did you go like the traditional or not traditional route of like like MFAs in grad school? Did you kind of like get that, life experience working, 5 years before you got into really writing as more full time? Like
No,
racking up life experience, I guess, wondering about that.
yeah, no, well, I mean, for me, I guess some people who I did go straight through to the PhD and I didn't do the MFA because the MFA wasn't the big deal at the time. My parents were
Mhm.
still kind of fighting me on this idea and I'd internalized it. So I was secretly writing a ton, but I wouldn't take workshops until I got to my doctorate. And I always, though, I didn't, come from money. And so in the end, even though my parents they'd kind of tried to eke out this middle class existence.
Mhm.
So I'd had a job, since I was 12 years old. I'd had, restaurant jobs, babysitting jobs, working at a train store job. I'd always worked. And because I didn't come from money, even though I had some kind of stipend when I was doing my master's and then my PhD. That's a 9-month contract of very little money. So I still
Mhm.
worked those jobs in the summer. And even when I got to my job as a creative writing professor, you have so much debt, you have a tremendous amount of debt, and
Mhm.
they're not able to give you teaching in the summer. So I still often had Joe jobs when I was a tenure track professor.
Hmm.
So I've had enough real life experience to know, I don't know. Yeah.
I love to know maybe about like Stephen King's imprint. Shining is a big part of the book. I don't know how much of that we'll give away, but obviously the book was made into the movie by Kubrick, the famous one. I think more people probably know the movie, even though the book was really well done and very well received. But just I was looking him up again on Wikipedia. I'm like, he's been writing since like 68, 1970, something like that. I mean, he's just been around. You still see him. Still got he's very prolific.
Yeah.
I just wonder what kind of imprint, how can we trace any of that in your writing?
I don't know if you'd be able to say, aha, this really is a clear moment of King influence, although it'd be
Mhm.
cool if someone did. I do think that he doesn't get his due respect for complex characterization. He puts his characters under pressure in interesting ways. His language is occasionally poetic, but it's often very clean and it moves you forward in this incredibly persuasive way. I think in the literary world, people are so invested in the poetry of language that they forget that it's still a skill set to be able to move through compulsively.
Hmm.
He's a master of structure. He's a speculative writer. And so, in some ways, his books are often really big and you're just sort of like wandering in his worlds, but somehow he's a compulsive read. And
Right.
I find that to be really interesting and admirable. And he just comes up with great shit. The guy is just got a great weird head.
Yeah.
And when I was a kid, he was omnipresent. Horror was king at the 80s and
Mm.
90s. Satanic Panic was on.
Mhm.
Um, and all of my friends, working class white folks, Indians, Latinx people, everyone read King. People were readers. I hate this whole idea that somehow if we're poor, we don't read. It's not true.
Mm.
And everyone was reading him and I adored him. I read pretty much everything he had to deliver, right? Just every
Mhm.
single thing. And then when I went to, like, as a college, I said I wanted to do my senior thesis on how King is sort of like explicating these big American fears and these big human fears. I was laughed at by my peers. They were like, it's ridiculous. Don't do that.
Mm,
And I think even though I was a tough personality, they did kind of get to me because I had completely stopped reading anything speculative. And it really did. It was like in my early 30s, I started watching Doctor Who again. I
mm,
read Lev Grossman's The Magicians, and Lev comes from an extremely academic and or literary background, but he's like me, he's a dork and he wants to read
mm,
and write dork things.
mhm,
And it was just over for me. I read Rendezvous with Rama, and I started reading fantasy and sci-fi, and then I realized, like, this is what I primarily watched was fantasy and sci-fi, and certainly horror was
mhm.
80% of what I watched. And then finally, however many years ago, I was like, I'm going to start reading horror. And I asked Stephen Graham Jones, like, who would you say is like absolutely literary, absolutely horror? And he recommended a novel called Experimental Film, and it was fantastic. And then it was just on. So after
Mm.
that, so
Wow. So, a nice segue into the book. The book is White Horse. If you're watching at home, it's over here, it's at my right shoulder.
mhm.
So, talking about like Stephen King, I remember in a creative writing class in college, we read On Writing from Stephen
Yeah,
King.
yeah,
And I just remember, I don't know that I'd ever necessarily, I didn't hate or dislike, but it was just kind of like, I was kind of, what's the word? Agnostic, right, towards Stephen
right,
King. And we
right,
read on writing, and it seemed so obvious and so stupid, but it's just like, wow, he's a writer. He's not a horror writer. He's a writer.
yeah,
He's a
yeah.
very talented writer who's got a lot to say about the craft, right? And again, that was a stupid realization, but one that did come to me. Um, on the book cover, you have the great Sylvia Garcia Moreno writes something about this being like a new wave horror. I can read it right here. Perfect new wave horror. That's an important word that I left out there. Perfect new wave horror. And so I guess I'm just getting at like the idea of horror and genre. Do you feel like you get painted into a corner kind of thing, like, oh, you're writing horror, you're different than other writers? Is it to you like, if it were your choice, you just say this is a book, this is a novel? Or
I
what
like
does genre mean, I
I
guess?
like that these distinctions are getting smashed because what's a little odd about the book world is like there's literary and there's genre. Neither one of these things is a genre.
Hmm.
Literary is a series of conventions. It's, depth of theme, complex characterization, attention to form and language, and it can be applied to any genre, right? Which it can be applied to horror, science fiction, realism.
Hmm.
And then something very, things that are very commercial, entertainment is first. Like you're not as concerned about depth of theme, complex characterization. You're just interested in entertainment. I think when book club fiction happens, it's both.
Hmm.
And then sometimes it's just idiosyncratic why something becomes a book club
Sure.
book. But I think that the horror community has actually been very kind to me because a lot of times they're the ones who've been pigeonholed. And I think that what's great about new wave horror is that it often can, like, there's a great book by S.A. Barnes, I think her name is, and it's called Dead Silence, and it's science fiction horror. It's freaking brilliant. But
Hmm.
a lot of horror kind of does all the things that I did in my realism, which is it's dark subject matter, but it's gritty and it takes place on this planet in this time, right? Or in a, again, with Moreno's book and another close time, the 50s. And yet you have these supernatural elements or slasher elements. Some people like body horror, right? Some books are more crimey. And so what they're doing is they're taking these different conventions, and what they're trying to do, and what I try to do, is make a more complete book that entertains, that's also smart, that takes elements of like all these fun supernatural things. I think what's funny about the literary crowd is that for them, is the ghost real? Oh, then it's genre. Is the ghost not real? It's literary. And I find that to be hilarious. What does that have to do with quality literature? It has nothing to do with it. And so what I like about contemporary horror is that, you have these superpowers, Stephen King, Clive Barker, and they were like the kings of the 80s and then in the 90s. And then as the genre sort of falls down and all these people are rebranded as thriller writers, now it's back up again for whatever reason, probably a lot of
Hmm.
reasons. And you have this very queer and or diverse group of writers who are also trying to
Hmm.
kind of
Hmm.
smash these conventions. And some of them are more literary, some of them more commercial.
Sure.
So yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that explanation. I can tell you're a professor. All right. I'd love to have you as a professor. It's like, all right, breaking it down. I had a chance to talk to Todd Goldberg, right? And I was, again, not necessarily maybe something that I would pick up, just by seeing the genre or whatever. And like, I mean, obviously, I mean, he's a wizard. I mean, he's such a great writer. And he was recommending, we were talking kind of the same kind of conversation. And he was like, basically like genre schmonra, like he's like, one of the best books I've read in the last 5 years is Steph Chaw.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it was like, yeah. And I read Steph Chaw. I was able to talk to Steph. Like, that's one of the greatest books I've ever read.
Yep. Yep. No,
Right.
crime and man, crime writers with one of the books I always recommend for craft. There's a couple, Ben Percy's Thrill Me, Chuck Wendick's Damn Fine Story, but Jane Cleland is a crime writer, and her book Mastering Suspense, Structure, and Plot is so good because these crime writers freaking nail structure.
Yeah.
And I love that. I mean, do an alternative structure if you want. That's cool. It doesn't have to be the Hollywood arc, but have a structure and care about it. And ththose crime writers, including Steph Chaw, my partner, I think they nail it. They're great.
Right. And so, the book was Your House Will Pay. And it was just like, I had some of my students read it. Teaching high school, and we had a book taste test, right? Where they get to read a chapter or so, and which one are you going to read? They had 12 to pick from. And like, I think 7 of the 12 picked, Steph Chaw, like,
That's
and they were so happy that they read it. Yeah. But
wow.
I was one that like, okay, it's crime fiction. Oh, maybe I wouldn't necessarily gravitate to that. No, that's a heck of a book. I mean, there's, so many themes of racism and, traumas. I mean, it's just incredible book. So just whatever name you slap on the back cover, whatever genre, it's a heck of a book.
Totally.
Same with, of course, White Horse.